As designers, we love to create experiences that people love. We spend time designing and developing products to help people complete their tasks in a frictionless, simple, and delightful way. But what about those times when things don't go to plan? What about those journeys that people uncover that you maybe haven't designed for, and people run into errors and issues and potentially get frustrated with the product? This video was inspired by a comment I received around how to identify edge cases. Before we get into that though, it's worth talking about a standard, typical design process that we might follow and how edge cases play a part in that. If we think how we would typically approach things, so we may have a customer, a user base in mind, a problem that they want to solve, and a business goal which aligns to those problems. So we spend time discovering, investigating the best way we can solve those problems through the product. We map out those personas of our primary users and we start to play those through a journey map. We have our core user journey. This is going from point A to B. People are completing their tasks without any issues, no errors, perfect. This is known as the happy path and is always a great starting point when you're fleshing out the journey within a product. But as we know, things aren't always perfect and things don't always go to plan. People will find new ways to complete tasks and there will be loopholes uncovered within your product that you maybe haven't even thought of. So how do we start to be more mindful about this? And what are the different types of edge cases that we can start to support right now? We can think about the typical edge cases that always crop up in products. We all know these, so they're error states, they're the problems when you're entering data that isn't supported, there are those empty states where there's no data available, and oftentimes they can be dead ends for us. We can see those and it can turn us off from the product, we can become frustrated, and it definitely has an impact on the way we perceive the way that product's been designed. So how can we make sure that we don't fall prey to that and that we are supporting our users in those moments where they veer off track and perhaps take a journey we didn't originally expect? So the first thing we can do is we can start to look at these common scenarios and these common edge cases that do crop up in most digital products. Even before we get domain specific and the niche that your product is in, we can start to knock off some of these edge cases by being more mindful about what happens when things don't go totally to plan in terms of user input. This is always a key one that I try to focus on initially, because as we all know, when we're designing an interface and we're presenting to stakeholders, for example, we often use content that fits the design perfectly. These might be times when we don't have actual data representative of customer input, so we use placeholder text, let's say, and we often use the perfect length and it just looks totally right in the interface. One thing we can start to do is just be realistic and try to push the limits of the interface and what happens when somebody might enter an extremely long string of text or they use certain special characters that we didn't initially expect. We can take examples from other products from this, and we can also think about our own customer base from a high level and think, what are the types of things they potentially could enter and how does the product respond to that? Equally with error states and empty states that are very common in digital products, how can we support people to then make the right choice going forward? How can we give people a way out of these scenarios without being presented with a dead end and again affecting their perception of the product? By starting with those core journeys, we can understand that typically somebody just wants to continue with their task. And if we know that primary goal, we can support people to do so in those error states and in those times where things don't go to plan. We can start to look at these early on within the product design cycle. When we think about the happy path, we can then factor in those error states, those times where things don't have as much data as typically expected, and when people might provide user-generated input and content and how we can support that in a practical way. The next group of edge cases is unlocking and understanding the more domain and industry specific scenarios and journeys that are particular to your product. Now, in my experience, the majority of these edge cases present themselves and crop up in discussions with end users and stakeholders who understand the domain. So it's good to take note of these during these discovery sessions, and as you go working with users and running usability tests and interviews and any discovery that you do, always be on the lookout for the potentially different ways that people see the tasks they complete and how you can factor that into your product. So once we have that happy path, which is a great starting point, we can start to think about the different underlying journeys or things that might veer off from that primary use case and consider what we'd like to support and how we can do that to make sure the user is always reaching their goal, even with these bumps in the road. So these can come in various shapes and sizes, and I think it is important to keep a list of these, and then further down the line you can start to prioritize which ones you feel are most important within your team and dedicate time to that. This is particularly important if you're working within a small design team or even a design team of one where you're tight on time and resource and you want to make sure you're delivering value all the time. So having that prioritized list of the edge cases that you've identified, both from a standard product perspective and from a more specific niche domain industry perspective that's specific to your type of product. There's absolutely nothing wrong with focusing on that happy path to start with, just to get the ball rolling, because a lot of the insights that you get around edge cases often come when you're testing the product. And if you can monitor how people actually move through the experience you've designed and where they come up against roadblocks, where they might be dropping off the journey and not actually completing their task, these are all signals where you can start to dig deeper, investigate, find out why people are experiencing the product in this way, what they're trying to do, and that can ultimately give you a whole host of different edge cases that you can consider in the product going forward. Something that often comes up when we talk about edge cases is the subject of accessibility. Now, the way I see this is that some level of accessibility should be baked into your product from day one. And as a designer, it's always a good position for you to be a champion for this, to make sure that you're supporting and giving your users the best chance, regardless of the disability or temporary impairment they may have. And I always find it's wise to think more of edge cases more about a particular journey and less about people within that. So it's good not to isolate people depending on their abilities, and this extends to people who maybe aren't familiar with your product. So there may be people who haven't used this type of product before and may need some help and assistance when doing so. So if we think of that in terms of making an inclusive product, then we can move away from thinking about certain groups of people as edge cases and more about the journey that they follow and supporting the different scenarios that people get into regardless of their abilities and how they are accessing the product. So remember, just because something is classed as an edge case doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. The important thing is to try and identify as many as possible through your typical design methods and process. Make note of these, prioritize, and then as a team decide which areas to focus on to support your users in the best way possible. If you found this useful, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.